recording now.
Some people might try
Hello?
to go down the hall, that's all.
Oh, that was me. Never mind. I just got a message. Okay. I'm gonna kill this one. Do we have an agenda for today's meeting?
Nope.
It's a, we're reviewing the two proposed legislation, two proposed bills.
Michael took the lead on it because he was kind of scheduling it.
All right. Do we have any results from minutes from last meeting so we can have guidance?
We don't have any minutes from the last meeting,
All right.
but we are reviewing the two bills, so and this is really what
Okay, we're gonna
first
review the
getting
two
into
bills.
this.
We're gonna mention the third at all?
No.
Not at all. Okay. All right.
Now, if people have ideas on funding, that's a good thing.
I've been given some suggestions as to things that are outside the scope of a fee. One of them is a gain share idea, where we either gain share off savings that are accumulated because of the prospective savings and what we do, and the suggestion was made by the governor's office by an individual there, that we create a firm that can actually go out and get a loan based on the potential gain share, turn it and monetize the gain share,
What's that?
and then pay back the loan. And that would give a seed money. And so the question is, what kind of gain share might we expect?
I'm gonna. We need to start tracking our meetings. How many meetings we've had. Group. So I'm gonna do that
that are
on one of these spreadsheets here.
so it's only pays for the accumulation of opportunity.
Maybe
And
it
it
takes
creates
time to
gain
read.
share.
The calendar continues
Because, and then we take the gain share
properly. You know, maybe
and that's the loan.
I want to make sure we have a.
And then we have dollars to cycle back because we now have an opportunity for a lease base, at least the, the and then that money recycles the money, recycles the money. The loan's paid.
So it's revolving fund in that
Creates
sense.
revolving.
Hello, who joined?
Hi, Susan Annabelle joined.
Hi, Susan. And then we had another suggestion that we take donations into the E-rate fund, which is already part of asset, because we have closely tied this to schools. And then it would fit then inside the purposes of the E-rate fund, although it may not be directly directed at E-rate. It is for purposes of education. And those donations then act as seed money, and then we refund the fund after through the circulation of dollars.
Donations from
What
what
am I
type
going
of
to do
source?
with that is.
Well, there's there's that commitment that was made to the ACC when Quest was purchased. That might be a suitable donation for a while, and then have that refunded after it's been taken care of.
That one.
That one, remember that? It's $60 million there?
It's 70 million, but it's over a period of time, and it's tied actually to physical plant, not to cash.
Okay.
So, I mean, we wouldn't,
You gotta spend the physical plant somewhere. This is creating physical plant. So
it's a different tax. It's a completely different tax.
anyway, so there's some donation possibilities that maybe
So she knows who's on the phone.
Again, let me interrupt and do some housekeeping. I think we probably want to officially start the meeting. It's about 5 minutes after 1:30. Is anyone, for those folks that are on the phone, would you like to tell us who you are and what your affiliation is, please?
It's just Susan and
Susan.
And Susan, we know you're there. Are you the only, anyone else on the phone besides Susan?
That's it.
That's all he can
Just it.
Okay, very good. So we have Susan Annabelle with Cox on the phone, and then Mike Keeling with Keeling Law Offices and Data Site Consortium here.
Jenny Nauman, technology lawyer, City of Tempe.
Hi, Susan, Mike DeMaria.
Galen Updike with Asset.
Eric Thomas, project manager with the project.
And Jeff Crane.
And that's our group this afternoon. There may be a few others that join us.
I invited a couple, and I don't know if they're gonna make it or not. I didn't get the
Yes.
notification.
I had email conversation with Bob Burns, and I don't believe he's joining in today, but he's definitely talking to the legislature.
Ah, here he is right now.
About,
Speaking of, Bob, your ears should be ready. Some of them.
We were
Sorry,
just,
wait.
your timing is good, Bob. We
Oh,
were
okay.
just introducing ourselves, and so if you'd like to introduce yourself, we'll
All
start
right.
out.
Bob Burns, Arizona Senate, retired.
Very good. And that's our group today. We're here to talk about two draft bills, the two highways for one, or the digital highway, as it's sometimes being called now, and the office, the broadband infrastructure office, infrastructure development office, and then potentially talking about some funding, although that hasn't reached the bill status at this point, but Galen mentioned some concepts for funding. So if we could first focus to the two highways for one bill, because I think that's the one that's closest to being ready to launch. And in earlier conversations with Senator Burns, the idea was to get those ready for launch as quickly as we can on it. And so if we can start out with that bill, and the latest version is a version that was emailed out. I think that Jeff emailed out to everyone on the committee. Could we start with that one? And anyone like to start this conversation there?
The question was, the one that was emailed out, right after our last meeting, you emailed out the document, and then you emailed it out again. Was there really any change on the
There
two
should not have
highways?
been, no.
I didn't notice any.
There was one emailed at 7:07, one emailed, that's one of two, two of two. And
Right.
That was done at 7 o'clock yesterday morning. Is that correct?
Is that what you're referring to? The two emails?
No, I think maybe it was the one that was passed out. I mean, I didn't notice that there was any,
Does
the
it
latest
say-
one said version 7, but I couldn't really tell in the document.
But
Does
the
it-
latest one is version 7.
And does it say the office?
And
No, this is the other one.
This is the
Oh, I'm
project.
sorry.
This is the two highways.
Okay.
Okay, but version 7 is the latest one. So you're looking at version 7.
And I just wondered if it was any different. Well, I don't know if this is version 7.
Okay, and no, there weren't
No changes.
significant changes between the two. And in fact, in our review with ADOT on version 7, the issue that they have is with the wording director shall. And so the input from this committee would be softening that language to an acceptable. And I asked Floyd what would be acceptable from him. He hasn't come back. I know he's circulating internally that question, but he hasn't come back. But I think from the perspective of this committee, hi, Emerson.
Hello.
From the perspective of this committee, what language would be, and what in particular word that they're concerned with is shall on it, and what language is appropriate in order to for ADOT to have a strong sense of that they should be going down doing this set of activities without the use of the word shall or must.
Well, the only other word that I'm familiar with is may. It's either usually shall or may.
And may is usually permissive, where shall
Right.
is affirmative.
So it depends on whether you want to sort of direct them or just have them cooperate.
Discussion?
Well, isn't it a question of money? I mean,
Well, we can limit it to when money's available, so and so that could be a modifier as well, yes.
The question that's always been with regard to right-of-way from the very start, when I began my inquiries 7 years ago as to what was needed, they said to me, Transportation said to me that they had never been directed to do anything with their particular role, except build roads. And that it would take something from the legislature to direct them to be concerned about broadband right-of-way or building some kind of, as they engineer the road, engineer a place for right-of-way for broadband, fiber. And the suggestion then to me was, if they will direct us to do it, we'll do it. Now, the question has always been about cost. And And you could give a proviso based on available funding.
Right, and I think we do want to do that.
And so the word shall accept that, and say shall accept that mitigated by available funding or something.
Based on available funds. But now then, let's talk about that a little bit, because let's say that we do make that that distinction for actual construction. But when you build a road, you start out going through the rights of way, the easements, rights of way, design, construction management aspects, and with planning inputs from the COGS, etc. And if the additional conduits are baked into that planning process, and the easements and rights of way that are negotiated, such that it's incrementally negotiated to have the rights of way and easements for telecommunication services as well as for vehicles, then I believe that's where a great deal of the economy is to be gained. So even though the actual construction may be a function of available funds, it's, I think, that upfront planning, we want to bake into that upfront planning the telecommunications conduits. Discussion on that.
And perhaps the word is shall consult with.
Well, now we've got to consult with for the council or for the office.
I'm talking about there is a cost associated with engineering also, and unless they get funding to pay for additional engineering costs, then they wouldn't do it. And we also need to go back and look at the selected sections of highway that the authority is going to take a look at, or the office is going to take a look at.
But before we go down that path, I'd like to stay on this language for a minute, and I'd like to talk about the cost of the engineering. What almost all roads now have is they have ITS conduit. And so it may well, and if they're going to do engineering for ITS conduit, ITS is Intelligent Transportation Systems conduit, then what we're talking about is an incremental number of conduits. And so arguably in the planning, that incremental number of whether you carry 4 conduits or 1 or 2, into planning stage, I don't really see that being a significant difference in the cost.
Would they engineer differently for their own intelligent fiber, their own, versus where an outsider comes in and utilizes it?
And the answer to that may well be yes.
I'm curious to know why ADOT doesn't want shall, because there is already a disclaimer in the first bullet that says as determined by the director. If as determined by the director the appropriate number is 0, you're still in compliance with the way the statute reads.
Correct. We've given them that
surprises
language
me
to start with. But,
because go ahead.
But good question.
But again, if they don't like directed.
But they don't like to be directed.
Yeah.
And so that's a cultural. They've got an out on funding, or for whatever the purpose that the director believes is appropriate not to do it. But they don't like the fact that they're being directed to, even though it's the legislature that is making the statement. So they would like to have that language softened from that perspective. Now we have some real life considerations that Galen was bringing up, but going back more fundamentally to what's the beef? What's the real issue from ADOT's perspective? Knowing that they have the out, because that language was intentionally put in and discussed with Floyd up front, there still is that desire not to have the director shall language in the bill.
But the flip side is if you
my suggestion is put the shall in, and you can always back off to may later. If you really want them to do something, you need to tell them shall, and work towards that. And then if the agency continues to resist having shall, then maybe you can negotiate a different term that works out, or you can negotiate them into a position where they support it without the word shall. I mean, that's what I would think is, and it'll depend on the sponsor of the bill as well. The sponsor of the bill is going to want to have some footprint in all of this.
Who's the transportation chair right now?
You know, I don't even know who the chairs are. I met with Wendy this morning, Wendy Baldo, who's the chief of staff at the Senate, and told her what we were trying to get to, that we were in the preliminary stages and that we would like to get to a consensus of language and then have that language brought to the legislature and have a folder opened, because a folder can be changed. So if we could get something in, at least in the preliminary stages, and get it into a folder, then the people on the council can all look at it and decide whether there's things in there they can't live with or whatever, or want changes, and it can be changed while it's in the folder. The last day for bill introduction in the Senate this coming session will be January 31st. And the House will have one more week. So that will be the drop dead date as far as getting a folder turned into a bill draft.
Is the sequence important?
Well, you know, what could be part of the issue, and again, because the discretion to spend the dollars, because of so much sweeping, that, you know, Mike, I don't know if one of the concerns may be, okay, the funds are allocated, they don't have the ability, 12 months, to spend those dollars, want to be able to put those dollars into an account that's gonna be specifically for this, without being swept back out, and have the discretion to be able to put, I mean, we'd have to put some parameters around that, but I wonder if it's just more about discretion of how those dollars are allocated inside their general fund, and if they're concerned that any additional dollars in there are gonna be seen as a target, because then they have money sitting in transportation funds that, you know, could go after again.
That could be a concern.
If you're trying to make things mushy, in a sense, you can always have because you have an introductory thing, something like where appropriate the director shall install, or when appropriate, or something that sets up the, you know, if all things kind of worked out, you've got the money, you've got the space, it makes sense. I mean, it does seem a little obvious that anytime you open up a hole in the ground, you should probably throw conduit in it. Kind of like you shouldn't probably build any type of building without making sure that a computer can operate in it. But it's Arizona, so there may well be an ADOT project on a road somewhere that's just not connected to anything, and maybe it doesn't make sense for conduit. And so maybe, and if there's no money, or if the cost benefit is such that it doesn't make sense, they want it out. But we're almost saying if all the stars align, we don't want you to have an out. And then
Well,
use
can you
those
say
stars.
it shall be a general policy that, and then back off? from the
Yeah,
general
one way,
policy?
you know, folks, they could attack this, or one way to address it is to figure out what are the specific conditions that ADOT feels like have to be met in order for them to be compelled to do this, and make those conditions. You know, you can have A, B, C, and D, and say, if, you know, if the project meets the following requirements and there's funding available, the director shall. My concern is if you just leave it as may, they have the discretion to say no under any circumstances. And I think there has to be some criteria or parameters given to this that gives them the comfort that, okay, if all these conditions are met, we're okay doing this.
Let me kind of summarize what I think I've heard from around the table. If one we could go with shall, we could drop the bill as is with ADOT, the director shall. Two, we could put a clause, a beginning clause of when appropriate, where appropriate, or
Subject
kind
to
of
available
beginning
funding,
clause.
whatever the
Yes.
hook is.
Third, we could go, and Susan, your suggestion is we could go back to Floyd, back to ADOT with an attempt to establish a list of conditions. And when those conditions are met, and these would be positive conditions such that when those are met, then the director would plan and construct conduit with new highway.
Yeah, and I think to Susan's point, that tightens up the language quite a bit. I mean, it takes a lot of ambiguity out of the situation for ADOT by being able to put those criteria. At the end of the day, for speed and for the ability not to haggle with a department, that sort of idea makes it much cleaner all the way around.
It's already in here, actually. If you look at B, it says that the director shall establish standards to carry out the purposes that look at population density. So maybe when the standards are met.
And so we may, in our negotiations back with ADOT, so it sounds like we want to go through a series of negotiations with ADOT. And we would most desire to have specific conditions. So maybe it's taking our current language and making that more crisp is one of those ways to do that, barring being able to get to that level of specificity in the time frame. Then we either could drop the bill with the shall language as is, or we could drop it with the when appropriate director shall
Or
suggestion.
subject to meeting the standards of section B, something like that. Because if B says that the directors.
How much input has ADOT had on the existing language?
Pretty much, they read it, they were bemused by the fact that there was a shall in there. They wanted to somehow mitigate that. They didn't say if we could mitigate the shall to make it sensical,
Yes.
and so that it met certain conditions, they would accept the shall. That seemed to be the sense that I
Yeah,
had.
because they're coming up with the
Is that what you
standards.
guys heard?
No, not at all. He was adamant on not wanting shall in there in any way.
He went through and redlined every shall out of, but then as we got back into the conversation,
Without them here, it's moot. Wait and see what they say back.
So I think we need to enter into that negotiation. Just to pick up on Jeff's point, we did get, we did hit a solid, we hit a nerve there, we hit a
Yeah.
solid wall.
Right.
there.
That's the first thing he
Of the-
started out with, was we've got to get rid of the
And-
shall.
And then we
and
tried to
we understood
chew away
that,
with
but
that.
as the conversation continued, it became the fact that, hey, we are in a new age. These transportation corridors go where we need to have them go.
Yeah, but not the shall part.
Again,
I know, but
we aren't gonna solve
Just,
that one today.
okay.
to kind of get through what we need to get through today.
And I have a couple of other questions that I wanted to ask about where it's appropriate for these two thoughts.
Okay.
Number one, is there in law in the state of Arizona a special classification for critical infrastructure? Does the word critical infrastructure act as a term of art that triggers other types of either benefits or tax benefits, tax breaks, those types of things? And I don't know the answer to that.
Okay, but we can research that. And then your second question.
And the second question has to do with the idea of changing the definition of transportation to include information. The purpose of, and the federal has, vehicular transportation, all the transport of goods and services, et cetera. And changing the definition of what is transported to include
Yes.
information.
Very good.
I can tell you, my folks would have a heart attack over that because of the federal definitions, the way they are, as it relates to information services. And there is some language federally, because we're a carrier of last resort, which becomes critical infrastructure because we're a carrier of last resort for E911 in a lot of rural areas. So there is, not so much on the state level, conflicts on the federal level, some things I know our guys would have serious heartburn with
Very
Mm-hmm.
good. good. And Eric, did you have any?
I would
input?
say one thing on the critical infrastructure term. I know based on former project, there is some language that attaches responsibility for critical infrastructure to DPS.
Yes, right.
So be cautious about where you want that.
Well, and that was a specific law that was carried by Harper.
I'm just saying,
some years
just
ago.
be aware of what, if you bring that into play, be careful what you're bringing into
And I
play.
understand that, and that specific, that assigned at certain times DPS to be the steward of quote critical infrastructure. You could specifically reference that law and create an exception or create a different meaning for this one if you needed to.
And that's why we came up with the term
Yeah.
essential
Yeah.
infrastructure. because at this point, in our search of Arizona statute, essential infrastructure does not have a statutory meaning or definition.
Right.
So that we thought we could then
Critical
derive or
infrastructure.
suggest one for, within some of this legislation.
And so my question was, I knew the critical infrastructure, it became a term of art, that DPS was over. And that was done on a I remember when that bill went through, I remember consternation that we felt about it because it was directed at something, and it actually put some things into DPS that I don't think were intended.
And again, just so you know, the concern over essential, critical, things of that nature, it has a tendency to move us long-term into something else that gets beyond the intent of what you're trying to come to. And then when the federal government can decide we're essential or critical, that changes the makeup of our plant and some ability for things that they can do during privacy. There's a whole slew of things you'd have to look into to make sure that that's covered, because you wouldn't want to get yourself into that bailiwick.
Good point, Mike. Could we then focus back to our 2 highways for 1? Because I'd like to try to launch that one as quickly as we can. I think that's the one where we can be successful time-wise. We talked about ADOT. Now, the good news is ADOT had one problem. They did not have problems with any other aspect of this final draft at this point, or at least if there are other ADOT problems, they haven't been voiced with this draft number 7. For this group, in reading the draft bill, are there any issues that you see, deficiency or changes that should be made? Question.
I think we're gonna find that out when you talk to ADOT again.
Well, again, we're kind of singling them out and making them special, but in addition to their issue, do any of the other stakeholders find issues with the bill as drafted at this point? Yes.
I thought you were going to say something.
Susan, from your perspective, deficiencies or issues with the version 7 of the bill draft?
Just a couple of things, probably more to clarify more than anything else. I know we've talked about this before, but the idea that the conduit would be separate for different providers, and I know that maybe it's getting a little bit into the weeds, but in A1, it talks about appropriate number of broadband conduits there, and it talks about accommodating multiple broadband providers. It must bear a little more clarity around that to make it clear that it's not intended that providers share the same conduit.
Very good. And Mike, I think that's an important issue from your perspective as well, is the idea, this notion that no conduit is a shared conduit, because that came up in our earlier conversations. Mike Golden is not here, but let me carry on a bit of that conversation. What's the definition of a conduit? And the idea is that for whatever that sheathing is around a particular fiber, that within that sheathing, an inner tube, for an example, inner duct, for an example, that is solely the domain of a given carrier or provider, but that there may well be more than one of those inner ducts within an overall raceway. And so it depends at what level we're critiquing.
Well, yeah,
I
because
believe.
you can have conduit, and then you can have the inner ducts within them, and then within the inner ducts, you can have the microducts. And, so it's possible to sort of have your own space
Yes.
in an inner duct within a conduit. So you don't necessarily need the whole conduit.
And that's the whole
But
point,
you
because
need
that's a
a
big
secured
deal in conduit
access.
price. And so Susan and Mike, I think since that issue is particularly of concern for your organizations, and the idea of there being inner duct within a conduit, or whatever that overall raceway is, and then that inner duct may have microducts in it, And the reason for the microducts is it's much easier to blow, the terminology in an industry is to blow fiber through it, through the microduct within an interduct. Question is, at what level is acceptable for non-shared space from your perspective?
Are you looking at it from a size perspective, or are you looking at, I mean, there's a couple different ways you can look at this based on individual, I mean, Susan, we've talked before, individual sheathing, I mean, there's a couple different ways you can look at inside the conduit, because it's just, you know, I think we had an idea from Mike originally that there was a size perspective. I think he was looking at into individual conduits, and I think we would define, could we define the different levels of conduit that way? Would
Yeah, I
that
think
be-
you almost have to, because,
Right.
I mean, you know, it started out with conduit and pulling fiber
Right.
through, but now it's gotten down
Inside of-
so tiny that even on a microduct, you'll have sort of little tiny.
Right.
I'm
ducts with them.
wondering if the word "at least" ought to be entered into.
Well, and now, and we probably, and this actually will doesn't have to all be in this, in statute, although the more statute is in statute, the more it's cast in stone. So you'll probably want, you know, to some extent to have it in statute. But it also, it turns out that in this draft, this actual decision is not made by ADOT, but it's made by the council or the office, if the office comes into existence.
Is it suitable to, in fact, state a purpose, to have a purpose statement within the law?
Well,
To give guidance?
you have legislative intent clauses.
Okay, is the legislative, as part of the law itself?
Yeah.
Are they outside the law?
Huh? No, I think they're printed right on the statute.
And the purpose
It's
is.
separate, but with.
And the purpose is to provide independent access
Yeah,
by different providers. And so, and that's where you want to maybe use the word at least 8
well, or
separate independent conduits.
you get in trouble the more you try to deal with today's technology,
That's a
because it's
problem
gonna
in
be,
statute.
but saying what you just said, and, you know, a sufficient number of conduits or interduct that will allow for independent, you know.
Independent access by separate providers.
Multiple
Whose
So you get
purpose-
that idea
Right.
in there without dictating too much.
I agree with Danae's suggestion. I think that might help bring some clarity around that issue. The purpose statements are nice, but they really don't have the effect of law. It's better to try to clarify the best we can in the language while respecting the, evolving technology, which is the challenge.
So where it says the size of each conduit is consistent with it could be the size of each conduit and or interduct or the number, I mean, to the extent that you're leaving a lot of discretion, I think. it's-
So let's add language there. Does anyone want to take on that language? Hearing none, I'm glad to straw man the language, but I really would like to make sure we're getting input
We should
from
have
the
the-
people
we
most
have-
interested.
We have the engineer from ADOT that's on this committee, so he would.
Well,
Maybe
now
not.
from their perspective, they are not worried about what goes in the outside raceway. But that, good question here, but that is within purview as it's been determined between Mike Golden and ADOT. What goes in the raceway is determined by the council, of which this is a subgroup of task group.
They'll manage the ditch.
Or the office, if the office is defined in legislation.
It does make some, I mean, putting in just another conduit that's, 1 1/4 inch versus, I mean, conduits they can be all different sizes. So to some extent, it probably does matter to ADOT, the number and the size.
Well, yeah, with the
But then they
size-
don't care what's going on within.
It's the within.
The within is the part that they will back to the DOA/ACIT, either within a council context or within a broadband infrastructure office context. Because they're saying they're not specialists in that area, and rather than they're getting involved in trying to arbitrate that, they'd rather somebody else do that and merely tell them what size of outside conduit or raceway and how many of them they should be putting in, acting as a construction manager. And so they would like that input given to them rather than they're getting in the middle of trying to wrestle with what those specifics are. That's
And
where
where
it
that
comes
comes into
coming.
play is when you get to bridges and crossing other rights of way, and the actual physical structure and engineering of it becomes an issue depending on how big it is and how much they have to.
But they still don't care
But
what's
they
inside.
still handle that outside the conduit versus inside. Eric, did you have?
I
any-
do. In the comment, there's an offhanded reference in a couple places to the vaults. I'm assuming in addition to the security of the separately accessible fiber, you also have that same issue in the vaults. Is that implied by the way this is worded or not?
We've tried to write this to imply that, but let's talk about that because again.
It's the same sort of access, you're gonna want multiple
vaults.
diverse points going
Yeah, multiple
into the vault.
controlled access.
Yeah, into this.
Again, like I say, it's kind of implied in that, but it just
But-
talks about the
and-
vaults.
But let's talk about that a little bit. And Susan, you probably want to weigh in on this as well. Where at the termination points or regeneration points, but the idea is that those separate internal raceways would terminate into a lockable space that where the only entity that has the key to that lockable space would be ADOT as the construction manager and maintenance manager for the physical plant and the particular provider of that particular space.
That just gets more challenging if you're sharing conduit. Conduit you can control it, but interduct you can't.
Well, actually, I think there are designs to do that.
Okay, sorry.
But Susan, your comment?
So I agree with how you just described it, Mike, that I think throughout the infrastructure, the need to have secure access for each provider to their own cover and other equipment would be a key, and how to describe that in the legislation so it covers everything appropriately, I think is the challenge we have to try to make sure that that's clear, to provide for independent and secure access for each provider to their facilities in the conduit.
I like your language of throughout the infrastructure. Is that, Mike, does that sound like the kind of language that we should probably? Okay.
Most of that can be handled in the definitions also, supported in the definitions.
And from the city's perspective, have you dealt with some similar kinds of issues where there's similar
Well, see-
language that would make sense?
Well, see, typically, when the trench is dug, if it's a joint trench, then each provider is probably having their own conduit. I don't think that we have, sometimes when the independent provider, they'll lease out fiber, so they somehow figure out how to have other people access it, especially if they're leasing dark fiber. That's gonna be a situation where they do it, but how they do it, I don't really know. But obviously, that's an issue if somebody wants to access it independently.
But I think for the bill language, if we say that throughout the infrastructure, that the independent path, the separate path, will be preserved. It's that kind of language. We'll do some wordsmithing on that, but I think that's the concept. And if that's in the ARS, then any rules or any follow-up of that will then adhere to that concept.
And one of the other qualifications that needs to be made clear, even in this legislation, is the level of expertise, the kind of an ETC type situation, eligible telecom provider, or maybe we'll create a new name like an eligible broadband provider or something. And and you can then refer to eligibility includes ILEC or CLEC status by the ACC, or ETC status established by the Arizona Corporation Commission for purposes of E-rate.
But aren't there gonna be a lot of providers that are not regulated by the ACC?
We're not saying, we're talking about eligible to in fact have access to these conduits. There has to be, or if they're a state contractor, for example, there's some eligibility that's provided there. There's a number of or type situations, but I think what it does is give a preemptive type access to these conduits by those already involved in the telecommunications industry that are already eligible through other processes like the ACC, for example. In other words, CLECs
Well,
are like some
procurement,
special.
right? I mean, if you're a qualified bidder, I think you're talking about who's qualified to install, or who's qualified to,
You're talking about
To
installing or
use.
using?
well, or to put cable, if you're gonna put cable in the conduit. I think that's what you're talking about.
See, the fiber is going to be owned by the entity that
The provider.
fills, the provider that fills the conduit. And not everybody, we need to have some sense that there's just not any citizen who says and hangs up a shield that says, I am a broadband provider, can have access to these. There has to be some qualifications.
Well, and that was my question, because wouldn't there be potential broadband providers that aren't an ILAC? or-
That's potential, and so the question becomes protecting yourself as a state through the things we would do at a local level with you, insurance requirements,
Right.
bonding requirements, those sort of things, because that's where you have to cover yourself at the end of the day. Because they could be eligible entities, and just use the word entities, but the entities, what is ADOT gonna require? Because that's almost a question to ADOT. What would they want as a minimum requirement to be inside their rights of way, from those perspectives?
Right. Now again, from ADOT's perspective, they're a construction manager for the raceways. But they don't want to be the administrator associated with who's eligible to use it.
But it's not putting, it's discussing with them, if someone goes into the conduit and they damage ADOT's property in the process, now whether it's in the rules of the authority, of the organization that's gonna do the oversight, but it's something to ask them about, because that's gonna be something they're gonna want covered, which is if any entity goes in there.
We have
Mark?
asked about that,
Yeah.
Jeff.
Oh, you were gonna go.
Okay.
During that meeting with Floyd, he did mention that they would take a role as a risk manager for
Okay.
those instances
Right.
when you are pulling the conduit or pulling the cable through the conduit. They would act
Right.
as the facilitators for that, being on site, controlling the access,
Okay.
egress, ingress, that type of thing.
Because they have safety concerns,
Right.
and it
Sure.
turns out that what Floyd wants to do, what ADOT wants to do, is use exactly their standard procedures right now for
Right.
anyone who is operating with, along the roadway within the various levels of safety zones along the roadway, and only the approved vendors, contractors that they already have, or that they would put in place specifically for this type of work, will then be allowed to actually do the construction work of pulling a fiber. And then the exact same thing for the maintenance. They will oversee the maintenance. They will utilize either their existing maintenance contractors or new maintenance contractors that specifically have the skill sets required for maintaining the fiber and the raceways over the lifetime of that infrastructure. And so rather than our having to recreate that whole 9 yards, they would rather that we merely piggyback on what they already have, and then they'll accommodate any new specific requirements that a given contractor may require in order to do this specific fiber-related work. And that's why they want us to think of them as a construction manager that already has those kinds of processes in place,
Yeah.
those risk management elements in place. Jeff, did you want to comment further?
Just that he was very adamant about they take the CM role, the risk management role, and then the administrative security role of
is theirs,
Yeah.
and they don't want to change those processes any more than necessary for accommodation.
Right.
So what they really don't want, which I think is good in
Right.
terms of our scope here, as well as when it goes to the members for their reflection, is we're not trying to recreate all of that, but we're rather trying to utilize what's in place.
And my point is this: we actually have a finite space. We don't, and we have physical parameters that fill that finite space. So eventually, if 8 conduits are not enough to fulfill all the demand, now we have to have a top-down approach to make sure that there's a shall we say, a process of approval of who can have who have access, or who has standing to have access for the particular.
Well, the question then though becomes the whole thing of underserved and,
Right.
I mean, if you've got that many people in there, that that changes probably that dynamic at that point. That's a little different.
Well, and so that
Scope.
that idea of 8 conduits isn't a uniform number throughout the state, but in the far reaches of the state where there's not a lot of population to be reached by those conduits, 8's probably the wrong number. And there may be other parts of the state where 8's is insufficient, although 8's a pretty large number. But the point is that number varies with location. Yes.
Right. I would say, as a practical matter, I mean, my understanding, the way I look at the problem is almost like poll attachments, and it would have to be first come, first served, and no one's going to come in there and ask, to put in conduit unless they have a purpose down the road, and if they see that the space is already gone, there's probably not any incentive for them to come in there.
There needs to be some process where somebody's given authority to prevent gaming of the system.
Well, and at this point,
That's not this.
That's not
You're
this.
absolutely right, that needs to be,
But
but
that's
that's not this.
not what we're talking about right now. That's a requirement up there at a high level, but on the ground for
Right.
what we're doing here, that's not this.
And the question is,
Mike,
Yes.
this is Susan, one thing to consider, and I know this is a little bit in the weeds, but it should be thought about, whether it's a rulemaking or direction given to ADOT if they want this responsibility to come up with parameters. But you may have situations where you have providers who are in that conduit who may have a change in ownership. You may have a transfer of ownership and acquisition. How do you handle those situations? And furthermore, and unfortunately, you may have a provider who goes in there and then at some point is no longer in business. What's the responsibility for managing that asset such that somebody can remove property fiber that's in there in order to allow other providers to use it? I mean, I know those are kind of questions that are down the road, but it's something to think about because those are things that absolutely happen in our business all the time.
Yes, indeed, Susan. Now those kinds of things, as well as the eligible provider, are conceptually in the other piece of legislation we want to talk about. The ADOT breakout was to break out a clean, small scope that we could run with more quickly, and that made sense to ADOT and would accommodate what ADOT is doing, such that it really is ADOT centric.
so that's
Now those
two
other things.
highways for the price. One is ADOT centric.
Correct. Now, those other things are in what we're calling the office right now. We call the authority, so you may have a look at documents on the authority, but it's now called the office. It is that entity that has to grapple with those things that we've been talking about now for several minutes. And if we could put those aside while we go forth with the ADOT, I think then maybe we can move the ADOT bill forward just with its limited scope. Not saying that we won't address those others, but because we'll do that next when we dig into the office legislation.
And I- this-
And then in this scenario, who ultimately owns the conduit? Is it ADOT or is it the office?
Who owns the conduit?
Yep.
That's a good question. The bill at this point does not address who owns it. It addresses who manages it, and it's thought of as a state ownership. But so Susan, maybe if we can parse a little bit the ownership, and the state owns it, but it's managed by ADOT for the physical infrastructure and maintenance of it, whereas the usage of it is managed by the broadband office.
Does the state rent the conduit?
And the state rents the conduit, and the monies that are made those rents go into a revolving fund in order to build additional conduit.
And those rents are basically associated with the cost of the building of the conduit, not some rate-based commercial value.
But again, that's not part of
No, that's
ADOT.
not part
So I'd like to. Yes, Eric.
I would ask ADOT, is there any other scenario within their rights of way where they do not own the physical run? Do you know that? Because I would think they would not want it to be different than whatever else they're
Well,
already
and
doing.
that's based on our early discussions with ADOT, is that ADOT doesn't actually own the road, but it is the manager of the road for the state. So the state is the entity that owns, but the ADOT is the entity that manages.
Stewart.
Jeff, did you have a comment on that?
ADOT acting as a construction manager is acting in the role of putting it in for the customer. Customer being asset or the office.
Correct.
The state.
And then the title, I think going to Susan's question, the title actually resides with the state of Arizona as an entity.
Not ADOT.
Does that clarify?
Yeah.
Are we all
Yeah.
on a similar song sheet?
Bob, is there any other
ADOT has no
entities like this in the state where,
At all.
these-
ADOT is the state of Arizona.
where we
Yeah,
have
but it's
guidance from
an
other
agency.
legislation that are similar to
ADOT's not
this,
gonna
like, for
own that
example, are waterways owned by the state, by citizens of the state? Or are they
Asset would be
typically
the
owned
customer.
by people who,
They're putting it in
pipelines
for,
are owned
and
by
then
the
they turn it over to the
individuals who
customer.
put them in? Is there anything that, any other entity like where the state citizens own something, like roads?
Not that I know of, I mean, off the top of my head,
There's largely two categories, as I understand it. There's the state lands, which are owned in trust, and so there's a trust there. And that is always distinguished in law from a property of the state. And the property of the state can be personal or real property of the state, but there's a distinction with regard to the state land, trust lands, and by law they are treated differently. So those are now arguably they're both state property, but they're held in differently, and they are treated by ARS differently on it. But they're still state property. So it's kind of like asking, does DOA own the buildings? Well, no, it doesn't own the buildings, but it manages the buildings for the state of Arizona, the owner of the building. And the buildings, for example, are not owned in trust, but they're owned outright in fee simples, in the land under the fee simple, as opposed to being owned in trust. But I think for the purposes of what we're wanting to do here, we should think of the state as being the owner, the title holder. We should think of ADOT as being the manager of that property of the state. And then, Susan, back to your point of a change in ownership, that would be a change in the possessor of a lease, a long-term lease of the right-of-way and the raceway. And oftentimes how SPO constructs those contracts is they allow for survivorship and for change of ownership of an entity as well as survivorship rights of the entities. And so, for example, if I have a state contract for services with the state through my company, and I sell my company to another entity, as long as that entity buys the company, buys the stock in my company, it now buys all the liabilities and benefits of the company, including the state contract. So that's what's actually in the uniform terms and conditions of the state procurement documents for how to handle that situation. The office, which we'll talk about next, will need to broach those kinds of issues in that legislation, and it may well be that we have a model with the state procurement office on the level of ARS detail that needs to be there for that particular kind of issue. But for purposes of the ADOT legislation, I don't think we have to broach that at this point. Open for discussion and glad to go find information otherwise, but I believe that's how we are at this point.
Is there a way to approach this? I mean, in reading it, when you look at it, it does do a lot of directives. It says the director shall. Even in situations where when you kind of read the rest of the language,